Hi, my name is Greg Soulliere. I'm the Regional Science Coordinator for the Upper Miss Great Lakes Region Joint Venture. And thank you for inviting me to present at the Emiquon Science Symposium. It seems like I've come full circle. After graduating from Stevens Point with a master's degree working on a waterfowl project, I worked for a year and a half with Frank Belrose at the River Research Laboratory. At least that's what it was called back in 1985. And I worked with Frank reading and reviewing wood duck publications and compiling data and really gathering all the information together that he and Dan Holm used to write the wood duck book. So I left the survey 1986 or early 87, started with the Michigan DNR where I worked for 18 years, first as a habitat biologist in the Eastern Upper Peninsula, and then the last 6 years as a wetland and waterfowl specialist, a state specialist in the Lansing office before taking this job. In 2004, I transferred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and started this new position that was established with the joint venture, the Regional Science Coordinator position. And it's been a great job. Spent 18 years at this. It's probably my last year. I don't expect to be working in 2023 at this position. In fact, I expect to be doing a lot more fishing, hunting, and traveling. So it's been a great ride, and it was fun to start at the River Research Lab in Havana, Illinois. So I thank Doug Blodgett especially for inviting me. Doug was working at the lab when I was there, and I remember shooting baskets out back with him and really enjoyed his company. We hadn't seen each other much in the last 36 years, but it was fun to hear from him on the phone and get the invite to present. And so here we are. And I'm going to share my screen and talk about conservation planning for birds, for wetland birds, in the Upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes Region Joint Venture. We do a lot of conservation planning and management for waterfowl, and today I'm going to talk more about water birds. In fact, I'll probably be talking about both water birds and waterfowl, but making some distinctions. But the title of this presentation is Wetland Bird Planning by the Upper Mississippi River Great Lakes Region Joint Venture, a partnership where science guides management. And that was really the focus that Doug wanted me to cover. So I'll go over the joint venture partnership, its governance, just briefly, talk about our science team who really spearhead the planning effort for the JV. I'll cover briefly how we've linked our regional conservation plans to continental plans. Our planning foundation, how do we base our plans and develop spatial models for conservation design and so on. I'll cover how we've been integrating biological and social objectives, and then how we've integrated across bird groups, particularly waterfowl and water birds, and then even developed a summary statement for managers to use our regional information, hopefully in a more productive way. Our management board, and these are the folks that represent the different agencies and organizations of the joint venture. We have 20 different joint venture representatives or 20 different board members from across the region. It's a 10-state region, but we also have non-government organizations involved with this overall partnership. Most of the board members are mid-level and upper-level managers. They have some authority in the agencies and organizations where they work, and they can commit resources, which is important at the board level. These folks are in charge of the implementation and communication of our joint venture products and actually oversee the on-the-ground work. The conservation planning side, and this is the group that I'm involved with, we have a joint venture technical committee, and when we became an all-bird joint venture in 2003, we developed bird group subcommittees or working groups. Actually, in 2004 and 2005, we came up with these working groups, and I'm going to cover some of the material developed by our water bird and waterfowl working groups. And the science team is made up of 4 different bird taxa committees or working groups: waterfowl, waterbirds, land birds, and shorebirds. And these members of our waterbird and waterfowl committees back in 2018 and 2017 were the folks that developed the material that I'm going to present today in our strategies for waterfowl and waterbirds. We have new people, we have turnover in these groups. And in fact, Ariel Fournier is a member of both our waterfowl and waterbird working groups now. And she's a recent candidate and just approved this week for our joint venture technical committee, which is the group that kind of oversees all aspects of scientific planning and technical advice to the joint venture management board. So Ariel is very much involved in what we've been doing the last couple of years, and she'll be even more involved in the future. We stepped down our continental plans for the different bird groups to our joint venture region. And we started out as a waterfowl joint venture in about 1998. And then we became a waterfowl, wetland joint venture. And in 2003, the joint venture management board decided that we have continental plans for different bird groups. And rather than having separate joint ventures, like many joint ventures, ours agreed that we would become an all-bird joint venture. Our JV still has a strong waterfowl, wetland bird focus, but we do conservation planning and habitat work, the partnership for land birds and shorebirds, as well as waterfowl and waterbirds. Between 2005 and 2007, we developed our first implementation plan. And within that implementation plan, we divided out chapters or sub-strategies for shorebirds, landbirds, waterfowl, and waterbirds. These strategies include the step down from the continental plans to our regional scale, and population objectives step down from the continental plans to our regional scale. In some cases, they were breeding objectives. In some cases, they were breeding and non-breeding. So this information was combined and added to our 2007 implementation plan, which had habitat objectives for all birds. In 2017, we revised our waterfowl strategy, and in 2018, our waterbird strategy. And over time, joint ventures have, again, been transitioning from waterfowl to all birds and now to birds and people. How do we make sure that what we're doing is relevant to people, it connects with people? And the goal of our latest strategies include guide regional conservation that results in habitat to support populations of priority waterfowl or waterbird species and related social values consistent with continental bird conservation goals. So I'll talk more about the social values and integration of social values and social objectives later, but joint venture planning really takes a strategic habitat conservation approach, and dating back to Will et al. On 2005, where we kind of segmented conservation planning up, or conservation up, into planning, conservation design, implementation, and evaluation. And really, we call it the strategic habitat conservation wheel. I'm sure you folks have heard about this, and I'll cover that a bit today with how we've conducted the planning and conservation design side, as well as just touched on evaluation a little bit. One of the main differences between current strategies and our previous strategies is that we've, in addition to a top-down, stepping down from the continental strategy to our region, we also did a better assessment of what's going on at the regional scale, trying to better understand what we have for landscape cover types, as well as populations of focal species, and looking at trends of species of conservation concern, and trying to get a better handle from the bottom up as well as the top down in our planning approach. We've also tried to use common terminology. We were very specific in our 2007 plans. Now we're a bit more general and using terms regularly found in the National Wetland Inventory as well as the National Land Cover Database, and terms that other joint ventures are using, so that when we manage for migratory birds, we're able to talk the same language, basically. For water birds, we took a non-breeding habitat focus. We've always had a non-breeding focus for waterfowl, or we use energy-based models to generate population objectives. But for water birds, we completed a water breeding side as well as a non-breeding side, and very much related to our waterfowl strategy. We've integrated social considerations, and the emphasis in our latest conservation strategies has been efficiency. How can we most efficiently deliver conservation? And we've actually included in our waterfowl strategy business principles that many wildlife professionals don't have much experience with. So talking about the net return on investment, opportunity cost. If we do work in one location, we're using resources that might be available and better spent at another location. So how do we assess those trade-offs before we commit to one site versus another? And then, as I mentioned, we have a complementary summary for managers where we combine objectives and explain habitat needs and the emphasis of our regional strategies for both waterfowl and water birds. We have foundational documents that we use for our planning efforts, and I'm going to just go over the water bird strategy here, where the background material that we counted on included a water bird for conservation at the continental scale, water bird conservation document at the continental scale. It hasn't been updated, it's getting old now, but more updated was the Upper Mississippi Valley Great Lakes Waterbird Conservation Plan, where we had a lot of population information to use. The JV Science Office developed state by BCR assessments that were very helpful at understanding what was going on within bird conservation regions of BCRs, and then within states within those BCRs, and then even stepping down smaller to the polygons, which we call state by BCR polygons. We had some partner monitoring and population survey data that went into the waterbird strategy, and then joint venture supported evaluation, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Key monitoring information for this conservation plan included the secretive marshbird breeding and population habitat survey. That had been something that had been going on for about 10 years prior to revision of the strategy, and that secretive marshbird information was quite valuable. The North American Breeding Bird Survey, obviously BBS, has been useful in all of our planning documents. We had the integrated waterbird management and monitoring information, especially for national wildlife refuges where people are not able to enter very easily and collect eBird data, and eBird data was one of our primary data sources, especially when looking at timing of migration and stopover ecology to plan for providing resources when birds are on the move between breeding areas and wintering areas. Finally, regarding ecological goods and services and some of those social objectives, we work closely with the LCCs, the Upper Midwest Great Lakes LCC for the northern half of the region, and then the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie LCC for the southern half of the region. And I'll discuss some of the priorities that we received guidance on from the LCCs. And then finally, U.S. Census and stakeholder surveys to get a better handle on the distribution and population trends for people, as well as some of the desires for stakeholders that might be interested and involved in conservation and supportive of conservation. Starting with our assessment, looking at population abundance trends, abundance and distribution across the JV region, we identified those species that are increasing in population abundance, which didn't get much time in our strategies. We really wanted to focus more closely on those species that were declining, especially those species of high conservation concern, where we might identify the bottleneck or the limiting factor that can really turn a population around. That was a strong focus of the strategy. And those species that were had most significant downward trends, or the species with the greatest downward trend, was black tern, but also common gallinule, sora, piebald grebe, American bittern, Virginia rail, and least bittern also had declining trends across our region. For biological planning, we use focal species of high continental, where our region represented a good portion of that species, and it was of high concern at the continental scale, and where we thought our region could make a difference with targeted and adequate and appropriate conservation for that species. With water birds, we didn't have a means to set abundance objectives like we did for waterfowl. So for those species that were declining or had declined significantly, we simply used a 50% increase target and able to use that to calculate our habitat objectives, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we had several species with population deficits. In other words, where population abundance was below objectives, and we established the deficit, the number of birds between current population levels and the population objective. And then we identified focal species to represent different guilds where we would concentrate our planning and monitoring on focal species and assume that they represented a guild of water birds, or likewise with waterfowl. Regarding habitat assessment, we have a very large and diverse JV region. The landscape is more intensively managed in the south half of the region and less intensively in the north half. So we have more intact landscapes in the very northern portion of the region, kind of a mix in the central portion, and as you folks that are familiar with Emiquon and surrounding landscapes know, more intensive agricultural, especially agricultural use of lands in the south half of the region. So I guess my point is it's a diverse region with a lot of different approaches and different things to consider, but also from a partner standpoint, when you think about our joint venture management board, these mid-level and upper level administrators and their networks of habitat implementers have a lot of things going on, a lot more than just bird conservation. So in our planning, we try to be somewhat simple in the approach. We try to translate highly scientific material into wording, that terminology that people will accept and hopefully understand and hopefully more easily embrace and implement. So that's a challenge because there is a lot of great scientific information out there, but at the same time, you're working with managers and administrators with a lot on their plate, a lot more than just birds. So this is just one of the challenges that we deal with when developing conservation strategies as a joint venture group. We use bird conservation regions, BCRs, as our primary planning units, and they're quite different from north to south. And this is one of the things that we discuss in more detail in our recent plans. In fact, we make some comparisons in the functional differences, contrasting BCRs in the north versus the south, and the greatest contrast, of course, is in BCR 12 versus BCR 22. In the north portion of the region, for example, we have 14% of the land cover in herbaceous emergent wetland and woody wetland, 11% in open water. So roughly 25% of that BCR is some type of wetland or open water. It's got relatively high breeding water bird abundance, relatively low people abundance, and a relatively slow human population growth rate. There's limited agriculture, so not a lot of land has been converted to ag. Only about 0.1% of the ag land is what we consider wet cropland, or cropland on hydric soils that could be easily converted back to wetland. Compare that with the southern half of the region, BCR 22, where less than 3% of the landscape is herbaceous or deciduous woody wetland or open water, and we have relatively low breeding density, but higher during the non-breeding period, obviously. And this is the case for waterfowl and water birds, where we have high densities of birds during migration and in some locations in winter, but lower densities during the breeding period for most waterfowl and water birds. We have higher people density in the southern half of the JV region, especially around urban centers, relatively high human population growth rate. So the expansion of those urban centers is much faster in the south half of the region than the north portion. We do have a lot of area, about 2 million acres of prospective wetland. So wet cropland, areas that were wetland that could potentially be restored, areas that were wetland are currently cropland, but could potentially be restored to wetland, certainly easier than areas that weren't wetland before. We also looked at what we call the conservation estate. What is the distribution of areas that are protected? Areas we can count on in perpetual bird habitat. And we find that a vast majority of these protected lands are in the northern third of the JV region. Areas without a lot of the human population, in areas with lower breeding duck density and lower non-breeding waterfowl density, but relatively important for water birds. So there are some pretty substantial differences. A lot of state and federal land in the north, more conservation easements remaining in private land in the south, but overall far more conservation estate or permanently protected area in the north part of the region. I mentioned this already with biological planning for all of our latest bird strategy revisions, and today we're talking about waterfowl and water birds. The theme is using common terminology, identifying focal species to represent guilds, and then describing high quality habitats in each of these plans for those focal species. And increasingly, we're integrating across bird groups. We're trying to integrate social objectives, and we did, I think, an especially good job with our water bird strategy when it came to integrating waterfowl objectives and talking about water bird objectives in the waterfowl strategy. So again, with the common terminology, in the case of National Wetland Inventory, we identified 4 primary classes that we were planning for wetland birds: forested wetland, the unconsolidated shore and bottom, so open water locations, aquatic bed, sites dominated by submerged aquatic plants, and then emergent wetland, whether persistent emergent or non-persistent emergent, areas that have water with emergent plants and ideally some inundation throughout the breeding and non-breeding period. We have these primary NWI wetland categories, and then we further subdivided when developing our bird guilds, our planning guilds, using NWI and NLCD categories. So this is a large region. We couldn't get real specific in our spatial analysis or spatial modeling. So we wanted to use what was readily available at the regional scale. NWI and NLCD they were both available, so that's what we used. And other large JV regions are trying to do the same thing. And again, we're trying to communicate our planning and communicate our techniques across regions. So we have these bird guilds with focal species highlighted for each of these NWI categories and sometimes subcategories, again using NLCD. In this case here, where we have emergent marsh guilds represented by American bittern, where we have really all wetland, but emergent with some aquatic bed or open water, versus the rails, king rail, soar, and yellow rail, that require some sedge meadow or even upland herbaceous adjacent to the wetland. So there's going to be overlap between community types used by focal species, but we tried to come up with general categories so that we could develop our habitat objectives. Further, we compared the water bird and waterfowl guilds, and what we're finding is that waterfowl are more abundant, generally using more diverse areas, and for the most part, if we can establish enough habitat for breeding and non-breeding waterfowl, we will generally cover the breeding and non-breeding water birds purely from a quantity standpoint. Now, there's in addition to that spatial distribution and abundance, there's a timing factor that we have to consider, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But with focal species, we wanted to have species where our region was important to continental scale populations. We wanted to make sure we recognize those species that are continentally or regionally of high conservation concern. They needed to represent a habitat guild. Factors that limit population growth. At least we wanted to have some understanding, some idea of where to focus conservation work. That's not always the case, especially with water birds, but where we lack the information, we identify a need, and then we can target our research and monitoring to address that need. And finally, a system of population monitoring. Not all of our focal species are monitored, but most are monitored at least at some location. They're not monitored across the region, but we have some monitoring taking place, and we have a monitoring technique established so that if we have resources eventually, we can expand monitoring. Using the monitoring information we have, we used it the best we could in different sources of information. We then developed models, spatial models, to depict the most important areas currently for the different focal species. In this case, we used American bittern, we used eBird data, we used marsh monitoring points, we used BBS routes, and then we used these NWI and NLCD spatial data to predict or to determine which community types were most used by the different focal species. And then with that information, we developed a landscape suitability index, and then determined where across the JV region we modeled where each of these focal species is likely to be most abundant right now. So areas to retain are more obvious in this type of map. Areas that can be restored aren't completely represented, but restoration and sites where the bird is already nearby or within a watershed are more likely to be used sooner. So again, we used a variety of monitoring data to develop spatial models to predict where birds are occurring, and we think we have a pretty good tool to help target conservation with the family of maps representing our different focal species. We had 8 focal species for the breeding period for water birds, 4 for waterfowl, and there are some differences. The BCR 23 portion of the JV region is very important for breeding ducks, whereas really the whole northern half of the JV region where wetlands are common, including across the BCR 12, the very northern portion, those areas are important for water birds, and the loons and the terns and bitterns and some of the water birds that aren't common breeders in the south half of the region are more common in the very north, where we have relatively low breeding duck densities. When it comes to the non-breeding period, we used duck harvest data, county level harvest data for waterfowl, and we used eBird data for those months of the non-breeding period for water birds to determine where birds, and we know there are assumptions there that eBird is reflective of where birds are, but we assume that birders are finding focal species in high abundance where those focal species occur in high abundance. But what we also did was we determined where the abundance was high relative to wetland area. If we were only looking at pure abundance during the non-breeding period, we'd have a lot of emphasis all across the region. Because even though abundance is lower in the north, we have a lot of wetlands in the north. So we would have a lot more emphasis in the north than these maps depict. But we wanted to make sure that the southern half of the region received a strong emphasis in conservation work. Again, we're working with partners from all across the region. We don't want to sink all of our money into the north, recognizing there are a lot of needs in the south. And if wetlands were there, we probably would have more birds there. So this was a way to include the south half of the region, looking at the abundance of birds per wetland area. And that's kind of unique. I don't know of any other joint venture that has done that, but we have a unique joint venture with the distribution of land use intensity and resulting bird activity. So let me shift quickly to social objectives and what we've been thinking about and working on when it comes to social objectives and integration of those objectives with our biological priorities. So we've talked a bit about breeding habitats for waterfowl and water birds, non-breeding habitats for waterfowl and water birds. But on this figure, we have one of our first social objectives, birding retention and recruitment. And we had a similar objective in our waterfowl strategy. It was hunter retention and recruitment. So we can get a better idea of where hunting and birding activity is strong by looking at eBird observations as well as county level harvest data. Regarding our fourth objective, maximizing outdoor recreation, we simply need to look at where are people. People based on surveys, people don't necessarily want to drive very far, especially on a daily basis, to run into green space or opportunities for birding and hunting and outdoor recreation. So we can focus conservation work near urban centers and expect that those areas probably will receive relatively high use. Our fifth objective, minimizing nutrient and sediment runoff detrimental to the Mississippi River system, this and addressing Gulf hypoxia, this was something that came out of the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie LCC. This was one of their highest priorities. And we thought, working with the LCC, we can use their information for where landscapes are most degraded, and if water bird habitat could be, waterfowl, wetland bird habitat could be restored in those locations to address nutrient and sediment runoff, we would be accommodating both birds and people with that type of focus. Finally, and in a similar way, maximizing health, function, and biological diversity of Great Lakes coastal zones. This was a focus for the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC, and in a similar way, trying to reduce sediment and nutrient runoff into those coastal areas from rivers and streams leading to those areas. So we took a similar approach, and we used a NLCD layer for development and urban, and came up with a map to help us focus conservation to try to address those sediment and nutrient runoff objectives. So getting back to bird habitats for waterfowl and waterbirds, and as well as hunting waterfowl and bird watching opportunities for waterbirds, we have these this family of maps now to help direct conservation depending on our priorities, but we can combine the waterfowl and waterbird maps along with outdoor recreation, addressing Gulf hypoxia, addressing coastal degradation, and actually target conservation to try to meet several objectives, several integrated objectives. And this is really unique for a joint venture. This is where our science team has really pulled together and used some new information and developed a decision support tool to target that conservation. Of course, we needed help from our management board, our implementers. We use them as representatives of the stakeholders across the JV region to help weight our objectives. And what they came up with, and what we use for our decision support tool, was a 30% weight for breeding habitat, 30% for non-breeding, and 10% each for bird hunting and bird watching, outdoor recreation, Gulf hypoxia, and Great Lakes coastal work, or Great Lakes coastal degradation. And the waterfowl strategy had the same weights, waterbird strategy had the same weights. So the management board was really helpful and supportive of this approach to develop the decision support tool. So getting back to habitat objectives and our focal species, there are really two habitat conservation approaches that we use in our planning: restoration and enhancement. Those objectives were developed to meet the needs of, or to help eliminate population deficits. In other words, just simply acquiring habitat isn't going to grow populations. You have to create more habitat with characteristics that meet the needs of those birds. So we've identified what quality habitat should look like in our plans, but using calculations for restoration and enhancement, we've determined how much more habitat is needed. And then when we're at population goal, we've determined what our retention objectives should be. And this is, these are unique features of joint venture plans. And you don't typically see this in state level plans or in local scale plans when translating population objectives into habitat objectives. So most of the species or focal species accounts that we have developing these objectives, they're relatively simple. We have detailed descriptions of what habitat should look like, but we come up with restoration objectives and retention objectives based on those species-specific objectives that we have in the strategies. And then, of course, we describe what that habitat should look like, or you probably shouldn't expect to see that focal species using that site. We combined all of the objectives for the focal species for the different community types. We have in our plans our restoration targets, our retention targets. These are in hectares for the different community types, and then in the focal species in parentheses following the community types. We step those regional goals down to bird conservation regions down to states and state by bird conservation region polygons. So local managers, they don't need to know what's needed across the region. They're often interested in what they need to focus on within their wildlife areas or private land surrounding wildlife areas, building complexes out, and they need to know what are the priorities. The joint venture plans have those priorities down to the state by BCR polygon. Our planning efforts include the decision support tool, as well as maps of where hydric soils and cultivated cropland, where that intersection occurs. So where were wetlands drained and are currently farmed? Those are the areas that will most likely produce very productive wetlands if restored. When combining or comparing waterfowl and water birds, as I mentioned earlier, most of the time waterfowl have a larger habitat requirement. But in our communication tool, our summary tool with the two strategies combined and highlighting those strategies, we have in these figures or in these tables within the summary, highlighted cells indicating where water birds had the higher habitat requirement. But like I said, most of the time, whether it's habitat restoration or habitat retention, waterfowl are simply more abundant and they generally have a higher habitat need. We provide our map of conservation estate, like I said, maybe helping managers determine where they can build out, where they have a foundation, a wildlife area, or a large conservation easement, where can they build out from there and provide a larger complex that would be of value to our species of concern that we've identified. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to better integrate across bird groups, and one of the things we like to think about, especially with areas that have that traditional management approach, moist soil management, attracting ducks, important to hunting in the fall, and often drained early in the summer, late spring, early summer, to return back into moist soil management, maybe drained earlier so that the bottom can be manipulated with farming tools and encouraging moist soil plants. We point out that some of our species of high conservation concern, particularly the rails and terns, are moving through the region at a different time than most of the ducks. So we want managers to know that, you know, maybe a part of their wildlife area ought to have water on it during late August and early September, which should work out fine for blue-winged teal, especially if you have blue-winged teal hunting opportunity, but also for rails and for black tern in particular. And likewise, in the spring, we've identified when peak abundance is going to occur for rails and terns, and we want to make sure that managed wetlands have at least some water on them to accommodate these species of high conservation concern during their migration stopovers. We have the summary tool available, or the summary communication tool available on our JV website. Basically, it's a call to action with highlights out of each of the bird group strategies and explaining the what, when, where, and how much habitat should be restored and retained to meet the needs of these priority wetland birds. And the how much, again, that's one of the things that the JV science team has strived to provide, stepping down population objectives from the continental scale to the regional scale into smaller scales, and then calculating that habitat abundance requirement to meet current population levels, as well as increasing population abundance to eliminate population deficits. In each of our strategies, we identify research and monitoring needs. We don't have all of the information, so in planning, we have to make assumptions, but we state those assumptions explicitly. We identify the information gaps, and over time, we fill those information gaps with JV-supported research and monitoring. And you'll find pages of titles of research projects. Many of you have probably been involved in these research projects, whether it's for your graduate degrees or in your current agency positions. The joint venture has partnered with many researchers over the years, and we have reports and publications that have been used to fine-tune, refine, and improve our strategies over time. These 5 projects listed here are 5 ongoing projects that haven't been completed, but we have a notice of funding opportunity that will be going out in late March for to help fill some more of those information gaps and improve our knowledge foundation for future planning. So in closing, just a few insights from being in this position for 18 years. The JVs have really embraced strategic habitat conservation with that planning, conservation design, habitat implementation, and then evaluation. It's really considered the model now for conservation planning. And again, the what, where, when, and how much is what we have tried to focus on, and what I think we've excelled at and hope to continue to improve at. Information provided in JV planning documents aligns well with priorities of various conservation grant programs. You can pull information right out of the JV strategies and insert it into the NAWCA grant applications or Great Lakes Restoration Initiative applications to help make that connection with joint ventures and ideally give you a boost when those applications are reviewed by the various councils and work groups that review them. So we have our continental connection. We're linked to the continental strategies, and hopefully when managers are developing these grant proposals, they're linking to our JV strategies. We're also integrating across bird groups, obviously with waterfowl and waterbirds, but increasingly looking at social objectives, how to be relevant to people. If people don't view bird conservation as important for birds as well as for them, whether it's groundwater recharge or water filtration or flood attenuation, if people don't view what we're doing as important, we're not going to be supported in the future, and bird habitat conservation is really going to struggle. So we want to address environmental concerns, but I think we need to get better at communicating out that what we're doing is more than just about birds. We still lack a good measure of landscape change and how that influences bird populations. We have these crude measures in NLCD, which is updated every 3 to 5 years, but we really don't understand how habitat has changed. We know bird population trends can help, and downward trends suggest habitat loss or degradation, but is it occurring on the breeding grounds? Is it migration stopover? Is it wintering areas? This information is still required for many of our species of concern. And as I mentioned, communication and implementation, making sure managers are addressing those habitat priorities in our JV planning documents. I think we can continue to emphasize that at the JV management board and through the network of implementers that they work with. So I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity for some discussion. We're always looking for feedback. We're always looking for ways to improve our JV planning effort. And let's see, recording the transcript has started. Okay, so I think that's it. And if you have questions, I hope we have an opportunity to cover them.